hover for a time, but hummingbirds are the only ones that really hover, and they do it a lot, and they do it with ease, and that's because their anatomy is a little bit different. Their wings are attached differently, and so they are able to move their wings in ways that other birds cannot, and that allows them this ability to maneuver and specifically to hover. And when they're hovering, it's usually at flowers, but we'll also see that they hover at other times as well. Hummingbirds are a New World group. You will only find them in North America, Central America, and South America. They have cousins in the Old World, things like sunbirds, other things that are nectar feeders that you will find in the Pacific Islands or in Africa. But hummingbirds are only birds that are found in the New World, and there's some 360 species, depending on who you talk to, of hummingbirds that you will find. And the greatest diversity of hummingbirds is actually down in Ecuador, an amazing, amazing place. I would highly recommend a visit if you are a hummingbird lover. There are some 200 species that you can see down in Ecuador. Here in North Carolina, we know and love the ruby-throated hummingbird. The adult male is here in the picture, and let's see if I can. Ruby-throateds, great thing about them, and hummingbirds in general, is that they do live fairly close to us, and they don't seem to be too fazed by us. This hummingbird in the picture got itself into trouble, got stuck into somebody's garage, got trapped for a little bit, got tired, and they were able to carry this little bird out, and in the process, the kids got an up-close and personal look at this little bird. Most people don't have the opportunity to see them quite this closely. Fortunately, I do in the work that I carry out when I'm tagging hummingbirds, when I'm trapping and banding them. Most people don't get this up close view. I will just add that I do a number of programs in the summertime that involve showing people hummingbirds up close, where I will be doing banding for an audience. And I'm hoping this summer that things will improve and I'll be able to do those presentations again. And a few of those happen here in the Triangle area, in the Raleigh area. So you want to stay tuned for that, and hopefully you'll get an up-close look like this little fella's getting of a ruby throat. You may think that this is an odd time of year to be having a hummingbird talk, and in actuality, here in North Carolina, not so much. Before we get into what's going on now in North Carolina in the winter, we need to talk a little bit about summertime and our ruby-throated hummingbird friends, which for the most part right now are down in Mexico and in Central America to spend the winter. They would have left here in the anywhere from the late summer to the early fall to make that journey southward, and they are down there wintering in a location year to year. They're pretty much wintering in the same spot, just like in the summertime. Most of our ruby-throated, when they come back to breed, are going to breed in generally the same area where they themselves hatched. So they kind of have a winter neighborhood and a summer neighborhood, and in between they fly thousands of miles, and they're doing that during daylight hours, and they're doing that all powered flight. They don't take advantage of the jet stream or air currents the way that some of our larger birds do, the hawks or the vultures. These guys and gals are making that journey during the daytime, all powered flight, and it does take them weeks to get from north to south or south to north. But our ruby throats, our breeding ruby throats, most of them have been gone since sometime in October. October's about the time that they leave, although this year we had reports of ruby-throateds that were still here into early November. It's been the pattern here in the last 10 years or so that we have had lingering ruby throats, late migrants that don't leave until a little bit later, because we generally now don't have our first real cold front, our first frost, until a good bit later than when I first started doing this work. And at that time, we could guarantee that that was going to happen sometime in the first 10 days of October. Not so much anymore. But our ruby-throateds that we're familiar with in the summertime, they're here from end of March, early April, into August, September, and in some cases well into October, depending on the individuals. So they are here for the breeding season during the warmer months. The adult male arrives ahead of the female. He's the one, as you can see, with the bright red throat and the black forked tail. He gets here and sets up his breeding territory ahead of the female. He will pick out a nice patch of hummingbird habitat. Oftentimes that's a nice wet spot where there's lots of thick vegetation, and he sits and he waits for a female. Females are more drab, basically iridescent green on the top and white underneath. Very good camouflage. In the ruby-throated hummingbird world, the female does all of the work when it comes to breeding. Yes, she seeks out a male. She will fly around, fly through different males' territories, and allow them to impress her. If she is suitably impressed, she'll allow the male to mate with her. And that will be after he does a series of fancy flight displays. He will do a pendulum type swing in front of her from side to side, swinging in an arc. And if she seems impressed, then he'll get in front of her and do what we call a shuttle display, where he's kind of zipping back and forth in front of her. And if she's suitably impressed, then he will copulate with her, and then she'll fly off, and that will be the end of it. The female is the one that does all of the nest building, the incubation, the feeding of the young. The male has no part in that. He's just out there to look handsome. The female then, as you can tell, is very well equipped to do this. She looks pretty much like a leaf when she is sitting motionless on her nest. And look at that nest. That nest is an amazing, amazing thing. It is built basically with her bill and with her feet, and she'll press it into place with her body. That is made up of soft materials like plant down and animal hair, and she'll create a very deep cup in which she'll lay two little white eggs, and she'll incubate those for a good 2 weeks until the young hatch. Now you can see that nest is also camouflaged with lichen that's growing on the branch of that tree. And you may or may not be able to see that it's actually glued in place using spider webbing. The nest itself will also be glued together with spider webbing, as well as perhaps some plant sap. So they use natural glues to hold that nest together. But being built with soft materials, it means that when the young hatch and as they grow, that nest, as you can see in this picture, will stretch some as those babies grow, because the youngsters are going to be about as big as mom by the time they leave the nest. These two little birds are still probably a good number of days away from leaving the nest. Hummingbirds take a good 3 weeks or so to develop before they leave the nest, a relatively long period of time for small birds. When you think of our Carolina wrens, for instance, they will only be in the nest from incubation till the time that they fledge, the time that they fly away or they leave the nest. It's only about 10 days. These birds will be in the nest for a good part of 3 weeks, and that's variable depending on how much food mom can find, thus how fast they grow. But these little birds will barely fit into that stretched out nest by the time they're ready to leave. As you can see, mom is right there. She basically does a sword swallowing act in order to feed these little birds, and she is constantly at it all day long, feeding herself, feeding them as they rapidly grow. It's pretty tough work, and here in North Carolina, we believe that the female has enough time during the summer months to be able to feed, to be able to care for 2 sets of 2 young. So she may raise four young in the course of a summer. The young leave the nest, and when they do leave, they are not with mom from that point on. They're in the nest a long time, but when they leave the nest, they're fully developed, fully ready for life on their own. This picture shows a young male. You can see he's got a few red feathers in his throat there. He also you can see the sort of brassy color in that green on his back, which tells us that he's a youngster. Also, if you look at the feathers on his head, they look dusted, and that's because young hummingbirds have white fringes on those head feathers. Those fringes will wear off in the first few weeks of life, but they will create the scalloped or dusted appearance on a very young hummingbird once it has left the nest. So hummingbirds basically are operating on instinct most of the time. And these youngsters, until they gain some experience, are going to be relying on instinct, that instinct that's handed down from generation to generation, that tells them how to feed, where to spend the night, how to get away from predators. All of those things are basically just instinctive for these birds. Interestingly, hummingbirds in the bird world, they have one of the largest brains for their body size, and it's, we think, because they need to have a lot of information stored up there, not only that which is handed down from generation to generation, but then that which they learn during their lifetime. And they do have a lot of spatial information they have to remember, not only where they hatch on the breeding grounds, but also things that they need to remember about their wintering area, and then everything about migration north and migration south. Because it's very interesting with ruby throateds, they take a different path in the spring than they do in the fall. Their migration is not a straight line. So that means they have a lot to remember about the journey to and from the breeding grounds, as well as all that information about life and food and all of that in both the winter and the summer area where they live. I'm not going to talk much tonight about hummingbird gardening because we just don't have time. That could be a topic that we could visit some other evening. But suffice to say that I think most of us know hummingbirds are drawn to red flowers, typically red tubular flowers, and flowers such as this coral honeysuckle, which is a native honeysuckle. These are plants that have evolved with hummingbirds. So they have the shape and the size of the bloom is really well adapted to allow hummingbirds only to feed, and that means to pollinate them. So you will notice that hummingbird plants typically do have a very long corolla, and oftentimes they are these bright colors. Hummingbirds can see red flowers, 1/2 to 3/4 of a mile away. That also means they can see your feeder 1/2 to 3/4 of a mile away, unobstructed view, of course. But a lot of hummingbird plants are red or brightly colored because they have evolved with hummingbirds who zero in on flowers that are red. There are lots of things that you can plant, native things, as well as there are some things that are not native, but they're not invasive, so I don't see that they're problematic. But there are a lot of things that you can plant here in North Carolina to attract hummingbirds. And quite honestly, planting things for them is better than having feeders. Feeders require care, and we know that if feeders are not well cared for, that it can cause problems for the birds. Really, if you can plant for them, and even if you do feed them with feeders, I would encourage you to do some planting for them as well. It's very easy to do. A lot of hummingbird plants are things that rabbits and deer, quite frankly, do not like. So if you want more information about that, you can get in touch with me. I have material on hummingbird gardening, but that's as much as I'm going to have time to say tonight. Right now, there are things in North Carolina that do bloom in the cooler months, not just during the summer. Right now, of course, camellias are one of the things that are blooming. For those of you who have, there are other things like winter honeysuckle, which is again like the camellias. It's not native, but there are things that do bloom in the winter that we find attract hummingbirds. There'll also be things that attract Baltimore orioles. And here in the Triangle area, we do have wintering orioles. And the wintering orioles will be attracted to those flowering plants, as well as to feeders and to berries and fruits. The other thing to keep in mind with hummingbirds, they do need, especially at this time of year, shelter, and that would come in the form of thick evergreen plantings. And of course, hollies are one of the things that we have here that's native. We have other native trees and shrubs that they use for cover also, everything from our pines to cedars to magnolias. There are lots of evergreen trees that they will utilize for shelter in the wintertime. And having that shelter is important all year round to keep them sheltered from the elements, as well as to keep them sheltered from predators. So the things that you plant in your yard or you may augment for hummingbirds, you want to be considering that shelter element as well as providing them with flowers. Even more so, you need to be aware of the fact that hummingbirds, more than anything, feed on insects. They feed on teeny insects. Basically any insect that will fit down the hatch, they will consume. And we just typically don't see hummingbirds feeding on insects a whole lot. If you spend a lot of time following a hummingbird around, you might actually see this happen. But often they're feeding on insects in thick vegetation where you can't see what they're doing. They clearly feed on some insects that they can sense are in the flowers they're visiting. But then they also do sit on an exposed perch, like this bird is doing, and watch for insects that they can grab out of the air. Interestingly, this photo was taken out towards the coast at Lake Mesquite, and I think it was taken in January, where there are hummingbirds. And big part of the reason for that is because there are lots of tiny insects out there, even during the cold months of the year. So hummingbirds, yes, they eat a lot of insects. They will grab them out of the air. They will take them wherever they can find them. And this is a very important thing to remember. And one of the myriad of reasons why in your yard you want to try to use as little in the way of chemical applications as possible, because if you care about your hummingbirds, having the insects is paramount. You can have all the flowers and the feeders in the world, but if the bugs are not there, the hummingbirds are not going to be there, or they're not going to be there for very long. So they really need the small insects. Very, very important. But yes, indeed, we do provide feeders. We've had feeders for hummingbirds on the landscape now since about the 1970s, commercially available since the 1980s. And what that does is it draws the birds into where we can see them. Feeders for hummingbirds are really nothing more than providing them with a little pick-me-up. It may help young hummingbirds over the hump as they learn and get to know how to do what they need to do as a hummingbird. But for the most part, feeders are just an augmentation. These birds are not subsisting on the sugar water we're providing. And what it really does is provides us with educational opportunities and entertainment. The entertainment value is quite high from having hummingbird feeders. But then, of course, the birds get pretty quickly territorial about their feeders, just like they would about flowers. And these are two young males that are going at it around a feeder out in Manio. Again, interestingly, this is a picture from the wintertime in a yard of a friend of mine who has hummingbirds pretty much 12 months of the year. And these two little guys were going at it one day around the feeder. I think they ended up on the ground for a little while, which is not a safe place for hummingbirds to be. Hummingbirds' legs are very weak. They don't walk, they don't hop. Their legs are only good for being connected to their feet, which are good for perching. They really don't have very strong feet at all. So being on the ground, it's hard for them to get back up into the air. If they're sitting on the ground, they're pretty vulnerable. But these two went at it for a little while, fighting over this particular feeder. One thing that I do have to remember to talk about is predators. Hummingbirds are most vulnerable to predation in the nest when they cannot fly yet. It's a big reason that hummingbird nests are so well camouflaged, and they actually, if you could see one, if I had one to show you, you'd see that it's a deep cup nest to be able to hold those babies if the wind is blowing, say, so the tree limb where the nest is blowing, but the young aren't going to fall out. But they're also going to be protected in there. They're going to be protected from the elements and also from predators. Predators that might find hummingbird eggs or hummingbird babies may be along the lines of maybe blackbirds, blue jays. Typically, a hummingbird nest is well out on the end of a branch where something like a squirrel would not be able to get to it, hopefully. So the young do have to be concerned with predators when they can't defend themselves. Adult hummingbirds, there are fewer predators, but there are predators out there. In this image, you can see a Carolina mantid, our native praying mantis, on a hummingbird feeder. The Carolina mantid is far too small to be able to grab a hummingbird, but something on the order of the size of a Chinese praying mantis, the ones that are imported, and some people will release into their yards as natural predators, can be an issue for hummingbirds. The Chinese mantids can and do catch hummingbirds, even at flowers. We have evidence of that. But other predators do include, unfortunately, cats. There are cats that find take an especial challenge to catch hummingbirds. So it's good to have your feeders well above ground level if there are cats around. There are fast-moving hawks like the sharp-shinned hawk that may catch a hummingbird, but it's a lot of effort for not much of a meal for something like an accipiter, a bird hawk, but they can and they do catch hummingbirds for sure. There are other things too that have been documented catching hummingbirds, believe it or not, things like bullfrogs, and we also have climbing snakes that may climb up around a feeder or climb up and find a nest in a tree. Black rat snakes or corn snakes that are climbing snakes may also take hummingbirds. But as adults, they are a lot less vulnerable to predation than they are as young. When you're feeding hummingbirds, yeah, you'll be feeding more than just hummingbirds if you feed for a while. There are other birds that like sugar water, and then yes, there are also squirrels. At night, you may find an opossum or a raccoon find your feeder. That can be a problem because they will carry a feeder away just like they would with something like a suet feeder. Yes, squirrels definitely have a sweet tooth, and we have squirrels in our yard, and I have to position the hummingbird feeders very carefully so that the squirrels can't get on the feeder, because not only do they drink the sugar water, but by virtue of their weight, they'll dump a lot of it out on the ground. So just be aware that when you're feeding hummingbirds, if you're using a feeder, you're going to be feeding more than just the hummers. But in the winter, I don't mind at all having sugar water out and having other birds take advantage of it, even if I don't have any hummingbirds. One of the most common nectar feeders in the wintertime is Baltimore orioles. But we also have house finches that drink out of hummingbird feeders, and we've got house finches doing that right now. And the purple finches that are here this winter have also, by virtue of watching the house finches, figured out the sugar water as well. But I've also had warblers like pine warblers, yellow-rump warblers that feed from the sugar water. Had an orange-crowned warbler one year. So you never know what other birds may take advantage of the sugar water, and it's a great thing for them to have. They like the hummingbirds. It's just a pick-me-up. It's nothing that they're going to make a steady diet out of. But having sugar water out, you very well may find that you're feeding more than just hummingbirds if the birds can get to the fluid. And you might have something as unusual as this yellow-throated warbler, which was using a hummingbird feeder again out near Lake Mesquite, and had figured out how to get into the sugar water here and became a regular visitor one winter. So sugar water in the winter may provide for hummingbirds, but in the absence of a hummingbird, you may have other takers, which is, in my book, a lot of fun to have. My work, whether it's summer or winter, revolves around not only banding hummingbirds, which is what I'll talk about next, but maintaining a statewide database of interesting sightings, unusual looking hummingbirds, or certainly now the wintering hummingbirds. I get reports from people, photos from people on a regular basis. Quite frankly, year round, I have folks that get in touch with me about hummingbirds, and that's great. So I am the repository for all kinds of information about hummingbirds in North Carolina. Statewide, I do travel statewide to do educational programs, talks like this, as well as I said, the banding demonstrations that I do in the summertime. And now in the wintertime, I will travel to where the hummingbirds are in order to learn about our wintering hummingbirds. It's one of my favorite things to do. Every winter is different, and this year is turning out to be very different, and one of the most interesting winters we've had in quite some time. So in addition to getting out to banding the birds, I'm maintaining this information for the state. But banding is something that I do when I travel around. I have a setup that's quite simple, and you see it here. It's a wire cage trap, which is a box with a trap door on the front that I can hold open with a string that you can see here in the picture. The large door on the front I hold open, and then there are two smaller doors on the sides, which I use later for taking the bird out of the trap. And I basically set up the trap with a feeder that the birds are used to coming to as bait inside, and I just stand back, literally stand back and wait. And I wait for a bird to come in and perch on the feeder, and when they perch on the feeder to drink, then I just let go of the string, the door drops, and I have my test subject. And it's a matter of just then using my hand to cup the bird. And quite honestly, hummingbirds, when they end up in the trap, their instinct is to fly up to get away. That's the typical bird instinct, is to fly up. And so they'll be around the roof of the trap. So I can usually just kind of corner them with my hand and gently take them out of the trap pretty quickly. There are other methods that we can use for catching hummingbirds. Sometimes it involves nets, mist nets. There are other types of traps. But this one for me is the quickest and the easiest in terms of setup, as well as for extracting the bird, so that the bird's in the trap for the least amount of time. And it's also something that I can move around with me when I visit multiple people during the day. It's an easy thing for me to set up, and it really works like a charm. I catch birds over and over with this trap. It's not uncommon for me in the summer at Weymouth Woods at the state park where I band hummingbirds to catch the same ruby throat over the course of the summer, maybe 6 or 8 times. There are days when I've caught the same bird 2 or 3 times. They're really not fazed by this. They really want the food. They really want the feeder, and they're not too fazed by me and what I'm doing, which is nice, because the whole reason that we band any bird is to get to know that bird over time. And if we were using some sort of a method that spooked them, that would be a problem. So having a method such as this to catch them that doesn't really affect their behavior or my ability to catch them again is really key. And it pretty much is that way. It's not something that typically spooks the birds at all. Once I have them in hand, I do work with them pretty quickly. It's just a matter of minutes. The first thing I'll do, of course, is put a band on their leg. This is a little aluminum band that weighs about 1/1000 of a gram, that's got a number letter combination on it. It's unique, like a social security number, like any bird band. It's unique. But in the case of hummingbird bands, we can only use 6 characters. That's all that will fit on this band. So the combination is laser printed on there. A letter, which is a prefix, shorthand, and then the suffix is 5 digits. So it'll be a letter series followed by 5 numbers. And it fits on the bird's leg just like a wristwatch. It's not going to come down over the bird's foot. It's not going to be at all binding. It'll move with the bird as the bird moves. And the bird doesn't even really know that it's there. But that's our permanent way of knowing individuals over space and time, is this little band. On songbirds, on larger birds, it's going to be an engraved band with 9 characters. Hummingbird bands are pretty similar. They're just scaled down versions of that. And so we get the band on, and we take a series of measurements and weight. And in the winter, of course, I'll take a series of photographs of the birds, because in the winter I'm particularly interested in these little guys and gals. There are some things that we see during banding that you just would not see otherwise. In the case of this ruby-throated individual, I actually caught it at the time when it was replacing its wing feathers. And this typically occurs down in the tropics when they are well south of us in the wintertime before they begin spring migration. But because we've got these ruby-throateds here in the wintertime, in North Carolina, ruby-throateds along the coast, I'm able to see these things and learn about this part of their life when they typically would not be around to be able to do that. It's a very unique opportunity to be able to see these birds in the wintertime and put the pieces together by banding birds and observing birds and recapturing these birds during the winter months. It's a very unique opportunity here in North Carolina. Also during the summer, I get reports of white hummingbirds just about every year. This year we had, I think, a record 5 white hummingbirds at the end of the summer, 2 of which were albinos. I got out to one of the albinos, but the bird foiled me. I could not catch it. Turned out it was using multiple feeders in the neighborhood, so it just decided to take off while I was there. But white hummingbirds are interesting in that they are all female. Seems to be sex-linked in hummingbirds. A full albino, such as this one that has no pigment in the bill, has red eyes, has pink feet. These are extremely rare, although we did have 2 this year mixed in with the 5 whitish hummingbirds that were reported. You can see on an albino, maybe you can slightly make it out in this image, is that bill has got capillaries going out to the very tip. And you can't see that typically on a black bill of a normal ruby-throated, but on this albino you can see that vascularization. And that is an important point. Hummingbird bills are not dead tissue. They are living tissue. They are vascularized, they are innervated. They can injure their bills, and if they injure their bills too severely, it will be a fatal situation. However, if they're abraded, they will heal. I've seen this quite a bit with ruby-throateds in the summertime, but seeing these white birds is really a treat. And that's another big thing that I do, is I try to get out to the white ones when I hear about them in the summer, but I oftentimes don't hear about them till after the fact, unfortunately. But this is another thing that I collect photos of and details on are the white ruby-throateds that are produced every year late in the summer. And what we seem to have learned from these white birds is they're always young of the year. They don't then seem to live very long, and there are many reasons for that. Probably the thing that's the most critical is that white plumage, white feathers are very brittle, and the lifestyle that these birds have, their feathers will get abraded pretty quickly from their activity, from their rapid flight, that those feathers are just not going to last long enough to keep these birds alive to make it for very long. Yes, they can be more readily seen by predators too, but I'm not sure that that's quite as important as the fact that they've got these subpar feathers all over their body. But we're hoping that one of these birds proves us wrong someday. But to date, all of the ruby-throats, the white ruby-throats that have been seen and been worked with and been photographed and banded, none of them have returned the following spring. And that brings us to what I want to spend some time talking about now. We don't have much time left, but is this wintering phenomenon of hummingbirds in North Carolina. And for those of you who are really bird watchers, you may know this little bird it's in the picture here. The bird that's on the screen now is the ruby-crowned kinglet. Ruby-crowned kinglets are here in the Carolinas in the wintertime. From the mountains to the coast, at least the foothills to the coast, by the thousands every year. They are very cold hardy, and they are, believe it or not much bigger than hummingbirds. They too feed on tiny insects. They are here all winter, every winter. Again, like I said, they are quite numerous. And when you think about these little birds surviving the winter, and by the way, ruby-crowned kinglets don't usually use feeders of any kind. People occasionally will attract them to sugar water or to suet. I think I've had maybe one bird in the past, one kinglet, that actually took advantage of feeders. So they might find your suet. But for the most part, most of the ruby-crowns that are out there are not getting any help from people. They are surviving the winter here. No matter, how cold or wet it is, they're here and they are able to survive. And our winter hummingbirds, they seem to be doing the same thing. Now here in the wintertime, and winter for my hummingbird work means anytime after November 1st through March 1st, most of the hummingbirds that I will get to know while band or we'll see pictures of, most of them turn out to the Rufus hummingbirds or Rufus Allens type hummingbirds, all in the genus Selasphus. These are hummingbirds that are very cold adapted. Here we have an adult male Rufus hummingbird. The Rufus, if you look at their range map, are found up into the northwestern U.S., up into southwestern Canada, and believe it, up into southeastern Alaska. These birds are breeding when there is snow on the ground up in those areas. They know how to handle cold. And if you think about it, I believe that a lot of our winter days are not much nicer. They're about the same as their summer days up in Alaska or up in Canada. They are very capable of surviving cold and wet conditions. And so these hardy western species we find here in the southeast, Rufus being the most numerous. But here in North Carolina, we've had 10 other species of hummingbirds in addition to ruby throats and Rufus hummingbirds over the years. We've documented 12 different species of hummingbird in North Carolina so far. And so, yes, most of those are western species, and most often they are hardy western species, birds that are found way to the north or at elevation in the Rockies, very capable of handling a North Carolina winter, even in the mountains of North Carolina, especially the southern mountains. Our northern mountains don't tend to hold winter hummingbirds all winter, but the southern mountains definitely do. Asheville, Hendersonville, and Point South, every year we'll have hummingbirds that are there for most, if not all, of the winter. And this year is no exception. Right now, we have on the order of, I didn't do an exact count because it keeps changing every day. I keep getting more and more reports. In North Carolina right now, we have on the order of about 60 of these Rufus type hummingbirds, maybe more. And we have them, yes, in the mountains right now, as well as in the Piedmont. And we've had a few also in the coastal plain that have gotten noticed in the coastal plain mixed in with ruby-throated out there. The problem with winter hummingbirds is that identification is extremely tricky. Unfortunately for me, the Rufus hummingbirds that turn up, virtually none of them, in fact I know of only one that's an adult male. They are generally either females or young of the year that are not in distinctive plumage yet. And so identifying them is very tricky because they have a close cousin, the Allen's hummingbird, from whom I cannot separate them most of the time unless I have the bird in my hand and I can look at individual feathers and take measurements and know for sure. So winter ID is tricky. That's one of the big things that I do when I hear from people. First is to allay their fears that these birds are not going to survive the winter. The second is just letting them know, that I may or may not be able to identify the bird right away, but that hopefully we'll get photos, or better yet, I'll get there to be able to catch and band the bird, and in the process be able to identify what kind of hummingbird they've got. This is a good shot of an adult female Rufus hummingbird. You can see she's got a rusty wash on her sides, and she's got rust in the tail. Otherwise, she looks a lot like a young male ruby-throated. She's got those feathers in the throat. A lot of the western species, the females do have some tipped iridescent feathers in the throat, and Rufus hummingbird females tend to, and they often get more of those tipped feathers in their throat each year, so that an older adult female will be quite colorful, even more colorful than this bird, and will have a good glob of tipped rufusy feathers in her gorget as she ages. By the way, these birds, Rufus live 4 to 7 years on average, ruby throats 3 to 5 years on average, not quite as long. And we have had Rufus hummingbirds here in North Carolina who have spent every winter of their life, we think, at the same feeder. So I've seen a few Rufus Hummingbirds 7 years in a row. And here in Raleigh, we've had 3 individuals like that, 3 individuals. And they've been, one was a male, the other 2 were females, that were here for 7 winters in a row at the same feeder. So this can happen. But also a lot of these Rufus and Rufus type hummingbirds, Rufus Allens type hummingbirds, will wander. They may not use the same feeder every year, and there's some, like this year, that seem to be moving around. They're just not settling in for the whole winter. The thing that I have to look at when I'm trying to differentiate Rufus from Allens, if I can, on a female or on a young bird, is the feather here that you see in the middle of the picture. It's the second from the innermost tail feather, and it's got that nipple on it, or kind of got a notch bitten out of the leading edge, so it's got this unique shape. This, and combination with the size of Rufus are slightly larger than Allens, and so I'm looking at the tail, and I'm also measuring the bird in order to paint the picture and figure out if I've got a Rufus versus an Allens. And most of the time, the birds do tend to be Rufus when I look at them closely, or if somebody can get me a really good spread tail shot, I get lucky with that, and I can identify the bird as a Rufus for sure. But we have had Allens hummingbirds here in the past, and we have an Allens hummingbird here this winter. This is an adult female Allens that I banded in Charlotte this past weekend. Very colorful little bird. The brownish color that you see there in the base of her tail and along her flanks is actually more of a chestnut in Allens hummingbirds than a Rufus. She was a beautiful, beautiful color, and when I had seen original photos and video of her before I actually caught her, I was suspicious she was something different, because she just had a different, really a different look to her. But I didn't know for sure till I got there and got her in my hand and was able to measure, and sure enough, she was smaller. She had different tail feathers. They were all kind of just rounded. There was no nipple or notch there. Definitely, she turned out to be a beautiful adult female. So we've had Allens here before that we know of. She's number 4 that we're aware of, but I suspect we've had Allens mixed in here. They're probably every year we've had an Allens that has just gone undetected, because it just looks so similar to the Rufus that we've not been able to tease it apart, because the bird's just not been handled, hasn't been banded. Beautiful little bird, and as you can see, this is her face. She's got a good number of tipped orange feathers there in her throat. Allens are not quite as hardy as Rufus, but we've had them manage cold temperatures in the foothills of North Carolina, as well as snow along the coast. These prior birds, very, very tough little birds. They seem to be able to handle the winter okay, but they're not known to breed at the latitudes and the elevation that the Rufus are. But like I said, they're here every year, and this year, luckily, so far anyway, we've found this one. There may be more. I've got lots of work to do before the winter's over in terms of banding and evaluating these hummingbirds. Another species that is here this winter is black-chinned hummingbird. This is an adult male black-chinned who, again, adult males look very distinctive, but most of the time the individuals that I hear about and go visit are not adult males in distinctive plumage. This nice adult male was from last fall. He's got his nice black throat and then bordered by that beautiful purple. Adult male is very distinctive. These are hummingbirds that are closely related to ruby-throated, so they look superficially like ruby-throated. However, there's some key differences. Not only is their tail shorter, but their wing feathers. If you look at this little hummingbird that's perched, this is a female black-chinned that was using a feeder in apex until recently. She has got an outer wing feather there that you can see is very rounded. Ruby-throated's wingtips are very pointed. Black-chins are rounded. She has some other features too that made her different, but again, this is a species that can be very hard, or if not impossible, for me to differentiate unless I have the bird in my hand. But in the case of this gal, we got some good photos so that I had a pretty good sense of who she was before I got there. But she's not the only one. We also have a young male over in the Greensboro area. This is his picture. He does not have any color in his throat yet that I'm aware of, but we'll see when I get there and handle him. You can see his tail is quite short, and he's also got that outer primary wing feather that's rather rounded. Black chins are the next species you'd encounter if you went west from here, in west of the Mississippi, in the southern part of the country. They're quite a wide range for black chins, and I strongly suspect that they're also here every year. We just may not notice them. I think, and I know that they get mixed in with ruby throateds along the coast, because I've caught plenty of them out there when I've been banding ruby throateds. They just, boom, all of a sudden I have one, and of course the homeowner doesn't even realize they've got something different than a ruby throat. But they are, again, ones that are tricky to identify, and banding allows us to understand and know for sure who they are and get more information on them. So we have these black chins, we have Rufus, we have Allens that are here this winter. I've got lots more work to do. This is the little male. This is a frontal shot, as you can see. There's no black, there's no purple showing yet in his throat, but if he stays in Greensboro long enough, by mid-January he should have some color in his throat. And if he stays all winter, which black chins don't normally do, they are notoriously unpredictable. He may stay all winter. If he does, by early February he'll be looking like an adult male. He'll have a lot of that black and purple. He'll have swapped out his tail feathers, so he'll, like an adult male ruby throat, he'll have a black, jet black forked tail. He'll have brand new wing feathers. He'll have a deeper green iridescence on his back. He will look very different than he does now. But my suspicion is he probably won't stay with us all winter. He probably will move on. But who knows? Only time will tell. In the winter, all of these homeowners, one of the first things we talk about is caring for their feeder. And it's quite simple, folks. In the winter, it's much easier because you don't have to change your feeders quite as often. About every 10 days to 2 weeks is all that's necessary, although I know a lot of people, when they're hosting winter bird, will definitely swap out their sugar water more often than that. But these days, there are actually commercial feeder heaters on the market, and these were developed mainly on the West Coast because Anna's hummingbirds on the West Coast now are spending the winter in Canada, up north, as far north as Canada, as well as in Oregon and Washington, and it gets very cold where they are. And so there's a whole new industry now of feeder heaters, and this is one variety, and there's also this variety also that you can buy commercially. And folks here in North Carolina have been experimenting with that, but there are also very simple ways, do-it-yourself ways to keep your feeder warm, like using a grow light like this, or a utility light, just to keep the food warmer. And quite honestly, we don't have to worry about sugar water freezing unless the temperature drops below 27 degrees, and we don't have daytime temperatures typically in the Piedmont or in the coastal plain where we have to worry about that very often. The folks in the mountains have a little bit more of a challenge. But here, most days you're not going to need something to keep your feeder thawed. And at night, the rule is to bring it inside. The birds don't feed at night, but then you need to make sure your feeder's out first thing, because just like in the summertime, they'll be there as soon as it's light enough to see the feeder because they need to eat first thing. So I would say if you haven't left a feeder up, it's never too late to put a feeder back out, because I know that we're going to have hummingbirds finding feeders here for quite some time this winter. We even have migrant Rufus hummingbirds who, believe it or not, begin migration in January that suddenly show up at a feeder in January or February. So it's never too late to attract a winter hummingbird. So if you put a feeder back up, put it somewhere where you can see it, and let me know if you attract a hummingbird, or maybe you're going to attract something interesting like one of these warblers or even an oriole to your sugar water, even if you don't have a hummingbird. But it is very exciting time. Oftentimes we end up with more years than I would imagine. We end up with a western species that is something other than a black-chinned or a Rufus hummingbird or an Allen's. I'm quite expecting that we're going to find somewhere along the line somebody has an Anna's hummingbird here this winter, which is another western species. There have been Annas spotted in the Northeast and in other eastern states this winter, And it's also possible we may find Calliope Hummingbird, which is the smallest hummingbird that we have. Calliopes are very cold adapted, even though they're so tiny. And I'm just waiting because I strongly suspect that there's a Calliope out there as well. So you could attract something very interesting to your feeders, but even if it's a Rufus Hummingbird, that's great too. If you do, yes, attract a hummingbird, or you hear about someone that has a hummingbird, even if it's somebody at the coast with a ruby-throated, I'd like to know about it, because these are all important pieces of information. And I just have to say, my research is made possible, as you can see here, and actually this information is not quite right in terms of my address, but my research is made possible by not only donations that people make to my work, but also just in the fact that people get in touch with me. This is a form of citizen science. If it weren't for the hosts that get in touch with me to let me know they have hummingbirds in the wintertime, I wouldn't be able to do what I do. And I'm very fortunate. I've got friends that I have made as a result of this research, people that have had hummingbirds many years, or at least more than 1 year, that I've gotten to know specifically through their hummingbird. And they have allowed me to come into their yards to get to know their hummingbirds. And it is very much a privilege to be able to do what I do. And it's very different than the summer ruby-throated work. This is very involved, and really is something that is reliant on people being in touch with me and being willing to allow me to work with them and work with their bird. And that's what makes it possible. And so that's what's keeping me hopping right now, because the report started rolling in mid-November, a little late this year, but every day I'm hearing from people all over North Carolina about their hummingbirds, and it's very exciting stuff. And I know it's going to continue, because we're only, just into December now, so got several months to go and lots of more banding trips to make. So the fun is just beginning. So I'll take questions. I think we have a little bit of time.
Yeah, so I'll kind of take over goalieing questions. So we did have a couple of questions that came on the chat, so we'll go ahead and address those first. But if you have a question, if you want to speak out loud, go ahead and raise your hand. If you don't want to do that, go ahead and throw your question in the chat. But the first question comes from Kevin. Cool trap, referring to the hummingbird trap. Are the tags the same color, or do you have color-coded options?
No, I use all standard bird banding lab hummingbird bands. What I will do with these birds, often in the wintertime, I do color mark the hummingbirds so that the hosts know, especially this year, we've got hosts that have multiple hummingbirds. I will color mark so that they know who's who and which birds have been banded. What I have to do in that case is I use a little bit of colored paint on the crown of the bird, on the bird's forehead, basically. And for Rufus Hummingbirds, I'm using orange. For black chins, I use green. And if you ever watch me band in the summer, you'll notice that ruby-throateds get white paint. So they're color-coded by species. And all of that is very much laid out in my permit. That is how I color mark my birds, and that is the only way I'm allowed to color mark them. But unfortunately, no, we have no color bands or any other way to do it with hummingbirds. It's generally using some form of paint on the bird, and unfortunately, that does not last as long as I would like. So it's a very short-term type color marker, but it does give us information for a while anyway.
Very cool. So our next question comes from Sarah. So why do you think few adult males are found in North Carolina in the winter?
Well, if you think about the population of the birds, and really any species of bird, out there in the wintertime, we have adult males, adult females, and then we have all of these young of the year, which early in the fall, early in the winter, you've got a lot of youngsters. During the course of the winter, some of those young, in fact, a good number of those youngsters won't make it. In the bird world, there's a lot of mortality from year to year, especially of young birds. And actually for ruby-throateds and Rufus both, the population is skewed in terms of adults towards females. So in actuality, there are fewer adult males, whether you're talking about Rufus or whether you're talking about ruby throateds. They are the smallest fraction of the population. So that is why there are literally fewer of them.
Awesome. So I think we have time for one more question. If anybody has it, speak now or forever hold your peace, I suppose. But I do have a question for you, Susan. Could you put the link to the information about that database in the chat for us, so that if we wanted to submit information, we can do so? It was a bit difficult to see on at least my laptop screen, so
Yes.
there's some folks that might have trouble at home.
Yes. Basically, the easiest way to get information to me or to even ask questions is to come through my email. So to send me an email. Even we have a reporting network through the museum's website, the Hummingbird Reporting Network. And if you fill out the form the electronic form at the museum website, it does come directly to my email. But a lot of people are finding me directly via my email, and that is totally fine. My email is Susan, SUSAN, at N as in Nancy, C as in Charles, A as in Apple, V as in Victor, E as in Edward, S as in Sam.com. That's Susan at NC80s.com.
All right, I'm throwing that in the chat, and I don't see any more questions here. So I'll go ahead and move on to wrapping up, since we are at time. I want to thank everybody for coming out. I will say, if you guys are interested in joining our talk next month we'll be having Rick Savage from the Carolina Wetlands Association. Some of you folks who are especially interested and are at environmental centers, you may be interested in joining that talk. And then the following month, we'll be having John Gerwin talking about birds of the Piedmont. And I will say, we are in the process of scheduling our speakers for the remainder of the year. So especially if you are an educator or a professional who would like to attend either virtually, I don't know when we'll actually be able to get back to doing in-person lectures, but if you're interested, please shoot me an email. We can get you guys on the docket to be a lecturer. And feel free to check out our programs that we have going on throughout the month. In February, we'll be picking up, but next month we have a sustainability and art program, so we'll be learning how to use recycled fabrics to make macrame plant holders, and we have a number of other programs available, so please check those out. And yeah, if nobody has any other questions, thank you so much for attending. Again, if you are getting your NCEE, I will be sending those forms out tomorrow. Right, and thank you so much to Susan.
Thanks. It was
Wonderful
great
information.
Hope I hear from some of you. That would be fantastic.
All right. Oh, again, I hope you can see the chat. You're getting tons of thank yous.